The words hung in the air, heavy and mocking. Move on. A dismissal cloaked in the guise of kindness. I felt my gut twist as I forced a nod, the polite response of a man who'd just been betrayed by the one who once guided him. Failure rippled through my career, and yet he stood beside me, a facade of concern etched into his arrogant smile. We all make mistakes, but sometimes it's best to let go. In that moment, I was no longer just the scapegoat for a project gone awry. No, I was the architect of my own demise, or so he thought. Exposed to the board as the source of the problem, I felt the gaze of 100 eyes, but it was the reflection of my former mentor I fixed on most. That smirk. It wasn't just conceit. It was a calculated move, a way to eliminate me from a game I never even wanted to play. Confusion morphed into a quiet realization. This was orchestrated, a string pulled from behind the curtain. I drifted through the office, a specter among the living, absorbing the whispers and the glances, the pulse of an unfolding war around me. Silence, I knew, was my secret weapon now, the calm before the storm. Instead of lashings out, I turned inward, crafting a strategy born of the shards he had flung at my feet. Each passing day, the flip side of his arrogance became glaringly evident. He was blind to the strength of those he dismissed. He thought I was weak, misguided by my loyalty. In truth, I was merely gathering observations like a spider weaving a web, unnoticed in plain sight. I smiled internally, embracing the raw energy of patience. Every misinterpreted move gave me space to conduct reconnaissance, specifically honing in on the weak spots of my rival. Each meeting, each casual comment, became information, tools to be wielded at the moment of my choosing. The world outside buzzed with urgency, but I held my breath, methodically crafting my ascent. While he reveled in his perceived superiority, I vanished from his radar, becoming the phantom in his corporate nightmare. I wasn't his failure. I was the echo of his reckoning, preparing to take the seat he thought was forever his. With every strategic breath I took, I fortified my resolve, my mind sharpening like a blade. I was tired of being a casualty of someone else's ambition. I would not merely move on. I would rise against the tide he had swept me under. In silence, I learned to flourish. The air thrummed with tension, the kind that crackles in silence. I sat across from him, my former mentor, as he wore his usual mask of feigned concern. His words floated in front of me like a specter. Move on. They were meant to evoke sympathy, yet behind them lurked betrayal, sharp and grinning. The weight of my demotion clung to me like a whisper of treachery, a bitter taste that settled in my throat. Betrayal looks like a friendly handshake, I realized. It was a careful facade, one he had crafted over years of mentorship, cloaking his manipulative intent. I had trusted him, poured my heart into the projects we shared, only to be ejected from the very arena I felt I belonged in. Now, I stood exposed, blamed for a failure orchestrated by his hand. Yet, rather than succumbing to the bitterness that threatened to cloud my judgment, I chose the colder path. With every passing day, I became the observer amidst a bustling corporate hive, studying the erratic dance of my rival who believed himself untouchable. I learned how he reveled in the shadows of the towering skyscrapers, convinced that his ambition coiled around others like a serpent, stifling their growth while he flourished. He was wrong. I was not his failure. I was the roots spreading deeper, drawing strength from the soil he dismissed. As I navigated the office halls, I cultivated distance from the whirlwind of chaos he thrived on. I realized my power lay in my silence, Where others raged and flailed, seeking immediate satisfaction, I focused. I distilled my emotions, channeling hurt into a calm resolve. Each misstep on his part illuminated the path I would take, and I learned to wield patience as my weapon. The days that stretched before me were cunningly filled with opportunities disguised as unglamorous tasks. I volunteered for the projects others avoided, knowing each was an unmarked territory where I could gather intel. I became an unseen player in a game I once thought was fixed against me. He never saw me, the phantom in his corporate nightmare, invisible yet essential. With every calculated move, I solidified my resolve. No more would I merely exist in his world. I was no longer the disciple. I was the architect of my own resurgence. I would rise, not in a blaze of glory, but through the quiet accumulation of strength. I wasn't moving on. I was preparing for a reckoning. The office buzzed around me like a hive of angry bees, each person engrossed in their own frantic rhythm. I moved through their chaos, feeling like a shadow slipping through the light of confrontation. The tension of betrayal lingered in the corners as I navigated past hurried clusters, each oblivious to my presence. To them, I was simply the man who had faded from the forefront, a casualty of circumstance. But deep down, I cradled a revelation. Silence breeds strength. Every whispered conversation, every sidelong glance was now starkly illuminating. I studied my former mentor's habits with unnerving precision. I cataloged his movements, his hidden insecurities. The air grew heavy with the smell of arrogance that clung to him as he strolled through the office, smug in his positions of power. I hadn't made the mistake of dismissing him. I had simply begun the quiet work of dismantling his empire. I took on the projects no one else wanted, the tedious, thankless tasks that others avoided like poison. The accounting spreadsheets labeled urgent, the client reports marked disastrous, all opportunities disguised as burdens. Each task was a pathway to insights I recorded in the confines of my mind, a well of information that would build the foundation of my strategy. While my rival's arrogance inflated his sense of security, I became less noticeable, a ghost in the glare of his ambition. I made it a ritual to observe the meetings that became the fabric of corporate gossip. Each interaction left a breadcrumb trail leading back to him, revealing vulnerabilities that only intensified within his self-satisfied cocoon. With each careful analysis, I began forming alliances in the shadows. Colleagues feeling the weight of his hubris. They whispered of decisions made behind closed doors, plots devised from the safety of his boardroom perch. Every time one spoke his disdain, they unwittingly added fuel to my growing flame, fanning the embers of my resolve. Mornings turned into silent calculations, afternoons filled with shared laughter echoing in the break room while my thoughts coiled tightly around revenge's promise. I had no intentions of a grand confrontation. I understood that my former mentor held his confidence like a cloak, but he had left the lapels unbuttoned, exposing the stitching of his bluster. Patience was my greatest ally, one that bore no echoes of rage or confrontation. The world outside remained oblivious, a chaotic spectacle beneath the ceaseless drone of office life. I leaned into that stillness, aware that true power thrived in the quiet, the unseen. Revenge would not announce itself. It would be a delicate execution delivered with the precision of a scalpel, an operation he wouldn't even know had begun until it was far too late. I wasn't moving on. I was moving into position, preparing for the meticulously planned overthrow of the man who thought himself unbeatable. With each passing day, the threads of revenge tightened. leading only to the one inevitable conclusion. I would take his job, and he wouldn't see it coming. In silence, I was building my dominion. I took a breath, steadying the pulse of my resolve, and began to move through the office with an ever tighter grip around the currents of power. It was no longer just a place of competition. It was a chessboard, and each meticulous step I took in the field became part of my silent strategy to alter the game without a single shout of confrontation. He thought he was the master orchestrating others, but I was the shadow lurking just beyond his beams of arrogance, cataloging his every choice. I watched him lean back in his chair, the satisfied grin a permanent accessory as he doled out praise for projects that weren't his. Ambition had twisted him into an unwitting child, unaware of the reckoning awaiting him in the very ecosystem he believed to control. Each day sharpened my perspective. Meetings no longer blurred into background noise. They became revelations. I noted who sought his approval and who resented his condescension. Those muted words, mingled with nervous laughter, began to form a tapestry of alliances waiting to be woven more tightly. I found the threads fraying, ready to snap beneath the strain of his arrogance. I anticipated his habits, learned how he toyed with the vulnerability of others, never realizing that the weakest link could also be the one that crumpled his empire. I seized upon the opportunities he overlooked, embracing the unpleasant tasks that transformed into gateways of insight. As my colleagues avoided chaos, I walked boldly into it, harvesting the lessons hidden within the tumult. Each unfinished report, each errant email said more than words could capture. They whispered answers to the conspiracy he wove around himself. Workers submerged in their own failures didn't see me rising amidst their struggles. I stayed under his radar, silent as a moonlit night, while he boasted of victories that had never been his. He remained fixated on superficial wins, blind to the citadel I was constructing from the most inconspicuous scraps of corporate life. Weeks passed, flowing into a rhythm of insidious momentum. I compiled risk assessments, audit notes, and every miscalculation he dismissed as mere setbacks. Penetrating the layers of executive bureaucracy, I accessed documents that revealed not just the cracks in his foundation, but the chasms leading to his undoing. In this process, I harnessed my ambition. No longer tethered by his deceit, I bent my motivations into tools, waiting to cut through the tendrils of his influence. Authority is siphoned from those who remain unaware, and he was a gilded tower on a foundation of sand. I smiled to myself for the first time in what felt like ages. The architectural plans blurred beyond vanity. Patience. I would remind myself as calm washed over my ambitions. This is a game of time, and I had all I needed. Each day played out like a serene melody, while fireworks erupted within me, the crescendo building toward an inevitable climax he wouldn't foresee. In silence, I continued threading the needle, until my descent into the shadows became the very fabric of his downfall. The beginnings of consequence whispered through the office, shaping itself with whispers that danced just out of his reach. I wove each moment into a tapestry that would soon divert the stream of his success into the quiet flood of his oblivion. I wasn't merely preparing for a reckoning. I was preparing the stage for his quiet exit, all while he wore his arrogance like a crown. I had grown independent, unyieldingly powerful, laying dormant and unnoticed until the moment ripened. I would no longer be defined by the failures he thrust upon me. I would break the rules he thought unbreakable, and when the moment arrived, he would simply watch as I mastered the game he now played alone. The fluorescent lights buzzed an unrelenting rhythm, each flicker echoing the pulse beneath my skin. I drifted through the office like a specter, unnoticed, my presence felt only through the slight shift of air as I moved past clusters of colleagues who remained caught in their whirlwinds of ambition. They were blind to the storm brewing beneath the surface, distracted by deadlines and projections, while I stealthily wove my own narrative amid their chaos. Days melted into one another. I found myself volunteering for the projects others shunned. The technical complications I embraced, relishing the extra hours lost to thankless assignments that would fortify my position. I tackled problems that stung, balancing spreadsheets of apathy with the weight of client expectations while always keeping one eye open. Each task, a seed planted in fertile ground, would yield insights no one else sought to uncover. I carved space among the debris of failure my mentor had left behind, positioned myself in the shadow of his arrogance. I perfected the art of remaining in his blind spot while ensuring the web I was spinning caught not only his attention, but the attention of those around him as well. The key was to become forgettable, a whisper among shouts, necessary yet entirely overlooked. As the weeks cascaded into one another, I watched him grow into his arrogance, every casual smirk in the hallway slathered in a veneer of unearned confidence. He was blissfully unaware of the fissures forming beneath his feet, a blind king overlooking the pawns, positioning themselves for a checkmate he couldn't anticipate. His laughter echoed down the corridors, mocking. Little did he know, it had become my soundtrack, fueling my metamorphosis from disillusioned subordinate to a cunning strategist. The tendrils of corporate gossip served as my sharpest tool. I tuned in to the murmurs echoing around the water cooler as colleagues expressed their frustrations. I absorbed every critical remark, nodding empathetically while contemplating how these sentiments could be weaponized against him. I was crafting a conspiratorial culture, one in which I would be recognized for expertise, not resentment. An expert in the shadows, sowing seeds of distrust, while his hubris blinded him to the threat coiling ever closer. Time ticked along, each tick a reminder that patience would bear the sweetest fruits. As I ingrained myself within the office fabric, I noticed how dismissals from him grew, his cruel remarks cloaked as jokes meant to elevate himself. I was drawing closer, the quiet predator circling its prey. My warmth was disarming. I engaged with smiles where he would sneer, winning loyalty slowly, meticulously. And there it was, the moment that shifted everything. I stumbled upon an email chain, a thread discarded like an old toy, considered useless. Its contents revealed layers of sensitive information, plans that my mentor had glanced over, dismissing as trivial. Each word oozed with potential, insight I could mold into the very weapon to overturn his reign. He thought he was untouchable, blind to the meticulous plotting unfolding beneath his nose. I'd become his shadow, maneuvering within the corridors of his empire, ensuring it continued to feed my ascendancy, staying quiet, yet increasingly essential. The thrill of control surged within me, simmering beneath the surface. He remained unaware of the stakes steadily rising, where the stakes for him were his ill-equipped perceptions and inflated ego. He was the architect of his demise, and meanwhile, I was the mastermind reclaiming the ground he'd stripped from me, reimagining it with every passing day. I wouldn't simply move on. I would rewrite the narrative, and he'd be left standing naked in the spotlight of his own arrogance. The day would come when he'd realize the true meaning of those two mocking words. A reckoning wrapped in silence. Patience, I told myself. It had been my mantra, woven into every calculated step I'd taken since the moment he told me to move on. I had been searching for the threads of his arrogance, pulling them taut, studying their strength. But now, amidst the routine rhythm of spreadsheets and presentations, I felt a tremor of uncertainty rumble through the corporate underbelly. I was in the break room pouring a cup of day-old coffee when Maya, a junior analyst whose whispers often traveled further than her footsteps, caught my eye. Her expression was furtive, worry etching little lines across her forehead. She glanced at me, then lowered her voice, as if the very walls had ears. "I don't know how to say this," she murmured, glancing around. "But I saw him. I overheard a conversation. He's planning something." My pulse quickened. Maya's voice was barely above a whisper, but the implications lingered between us, thickened by the gravity of our surroundings. Something shifted. No longer was I the unseen observer. I felt the watchful eyes of a predator returning to my own nest. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, even as alarm bells rang in my head. "It's about the project," she said, leaning in, urgency radiating from her every word. "He's compiling a report to revise the strategy. Some performance metrics need adjusting, and it could be ugly for you if he loses any credibility." I nodded, but inside, a tempest was brewing. His arrogance had led him to believe himself untouchable, yet there was a slip, a chink in the armor of his confidence, something I hadn't seen until now. This could disrupt weeks of careful observation. It was a complication I had not anticipated. "Keep your head down," I advised her. "Be discreet. I appreciate you telling me." The moment Maya walked away, the weight of the brewing storm settled on my shoulders. I had entrusted her with vital information, a reminder that my web was not as tightly woven as I presumed. Had my careful plans made me vulnerable? I returned to my desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard, uncertainty swirling like paper in the wind. Each keystroke now felt heavy, weighted with the potential of unforeseen consequences. I had trained myself to be invisible, a phantom among shadows. But if he was preparing an offensive, the silence would shatter. The archives I had meticulously built were fragile, teetering on the brink of exposure. I took a deep breath, steadying my resolve. If he thought he could pivot and change the narrative without my intervention, he was wrong. I would recalibrate, but not react impulsively. My revenge would breathe through the cracks of his confidence now exposed, not with violence, but with the same precision that dance across a blade. In the weeks to come, I would bear witness to his moves from the periphery, gathering intel, reinforcing my foundation, extracting every shred of insight that came my way. I would not let panic govern my next steps. I would drown out the noise and think independently. Confusion could not find its way into my carefully honed strategy. This was a recalibration, a chance to sharpen the very knife with which I would cut him down. I resolved to lay low, adjusting my method without abandoning the goal. I had risen through darkness, and it was time to guide the storm back, directing its fury against the very man who thought he was orchestrating my collapse. My hands glided over the keyboard, as the shadows whispered the silent secrets I grew to celebrate. I'd find a way to use the turbulence against him, reminding him, as he had reminded me, that moving on is not an abdication of strength, but an evolution. He would indeed learn the true meaning of his dismissive words. In the meantime, patience would be my cloak, and silence my sword. The air in the office felt electric, static clinging to my skin as I prepared to execute my plan, the quiet reshaping of power into my hands. My former mentor, confident in his arrogance, roamed freely, oblivious that I had been carving my space in the shadows. Each day, I had moved through his empire like a phantom, dissolving into the gray fabric of an unforgiving corporate jungle. He never bothered to look closely. The predator had become blind to the ensnaring design weaved around him. I had gathered insights like a seasoned hunter, dissecting every flaw, each hubristic quip and withering dismissal that floated from his lips. Now, the culmination of patient observation lay before me, formatted perfectly in a strategic brief. This document wouldn't be my voice. It would be my silence speaking through numbers and solutions he had ignored. Revenge wasn't loud. It was an ascension, cloaked in the minutiae of corporate jargon. With each keystroke, I recalled the moment he told me to move on. How simple it sounded, yet underneath lay a darkness I had nurtured. I had taken those words, infused them with intent, and devised a plan that would return the power to its rightful master, me. His understanding of the game was flawed. I reviewed the brief one last time before sending it, mind racing over the implications. It solved a problem he had created, one he was too pressured to acknowledge. I recalled the endless lines of data I'd sifted through, the late hours spent dissecting trends and metrics he had recklessly ignored. Every detail whispered his incompetence while illuminating my capability. The moment I hit send, it was more than just an email. It was a declaration of war masked as an internal memo. I felt the pulse of the office shift around me, a tide turning without ceremony or confrontation. Executives who had only followed him now had a new lodestar, and I wasn't merely offering solutions. I was unveiling a truth he had crafted with his own hands. In that moment, I embraced something new, triumph through restraint. Ego, which had once fueled my desire for retribution, faded into the background. Instead, the thrill of being the architect of change surged through me. My internal narrative grew sharper with each passing second. Control was not lost, but gained through calculated moves, quiet and decisive. I glanced up from my screen, taking in the office buzzing around me, unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred. It felt euphoric, but it wasn't joy I felt. It was clarity. I had navigated through labyrinthine corridors of deceit to find this moment, conquering the chaos with precision and mastery. There would be no need for theatrics. As the minutes unfolded, I saw glimpses of a future freeing from the weight of betrayal, yet firmly grounded in reality. The noise blurring around me faded into an ambient hum as I reveled in the knowledge that I had replaced power without a single shout. No trumpets announced my ascent. Only whispers of impending consequences hung in the air, binding my past to the promised future. The man who had once occupied the throne of my aspirations would soon grasp the full weight of his underestimation. His dismissal had spawned my evolution. Revenge was not a strike. It was the slow and deliberate transition of authority, a fluid motion of subtle dominance. For too long, I had been merely reacting to his orchestrations. Now I was not just moving on, I was redefining the game. The silence I wore as armor became the source of my strength. The quiet pulse before the transition. A warning he had overlooked. I wasn't bound by the emotional chains of rage but would guide the storm, reshaping it into clarity and calm. As I settled back in my chair, anticipation electrified my thoughts, simmering into resolve. I had laid the groundwork with deliberation, and soon the time would come for the storm to expose him, not with bluster and foolish bravado, but through the quiet execution of a plan that had been set in motion long before my fingers danced across the keyboard. It was time for him to understand the cost of underestimating his former mentee, the man he thought would simply move on. The world outside my office glimmered through glass, a shining facade masking the turmoil within. Days turned into weeks, yet the air remained thick with an unspoken reckoning, tension brewing like dark clouds on the horizon. I had sent the strategy brief, and as it whirled through the corporate machinery, it bore consequences like silent artillery poised to strike. My former mentor moved through the halls, the confident smile on his face buoying him up, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of unrest that hadn't been there before. He was reacting, I could sense it. The blurred lines of his arrogance came into focus, vivid as lightning slicing through a stormy sky. Misplaced confidence had made him careless, each dismissive remark now carrying the weight of his looming downfall. He laughed a little too loudly, spoke a little too fast. I observed him from the corner of my eye, feeding off his increasingly frantic energy like a predator entwined in the chaotic fervor of a wounded beast. Soon, he'd realize that he was being hunted, not in a rush, but with the patient precision of a wolf circling its prey. The office environment buzzed around me like a hive under siege, the urgency palpable, but it was my silence that wielded power. I smiled softly as colleagues dropped murmurs of discontent about his recently revised strategies. The whispers echoed my own strategies somewhere just out of sight, and I pulled the threads tighter, weaving a tapestry of doubt. Each day I watched, listening to his fluctuations of authority, how he grasped to maintain control while chaos unspooled beneath the surface like a treacherous current. Maya's warning had been the first crack in his armor, and now several more fissures appeared. Internal audits would soon bloom, bringing with them the light that exposed the rot at the heart of his confidence, the source of my revenge. Drowning in a sea of metrics, I mused to myself, thoughts flashing like dark thunderheads above. Numbers exposed every weakness he'd crafted through his pride and careless assumptions. I remained detached, an unyielding observer, noting every twitch and flinch that marked the decline of his facade. Yet in the midst of this stormy atmosphere, a strange satisfaction settled over me, an icy calm. I wasn't reveling in his downfall. No, it was much deeper than that. I sought to restore balance, a twist of fate that would return what had been disrupted. Order demanded my rise. His foolish dismissal had sowed the seeds of his own destruction. When the internal audit finally released its findings, the weight of inevitability hung heavily in the air. I felt a tempest of anticipation. It was no longer a matter of if, but when he would be stripped of his entitlements, thrust into the cold shadow of obsolescence. He was blinded by his hubris, stumbling into a trap he had helped forge with his own hands. As his name appeared on the still warm document, my breath caught for just a moment. There it was, a whisper of justice, the silent confirmation that his fall was now irreversible. Each member of the boardroom who once revered him would feel betrayed by the man they had entrusted. A fall not with a cataclysm, but through the meticulous orchestration of his own miscalculations. In that moment, satisfaction coursed through me, not born out of malice but from a sense of order restored. I was poised. Heaven and earth shifted at last into place. My path had been carved in shadows, and the storm that once threatened to consume me had become my harbinger, heralding a new dawn where the seat he had so fiercely gripped would soon become mine. The quiet of my victory settled over me like a cloak as uncertainty engulfed him. Each beat of heart in the office thrummed with a charged energy, a predator nearing the kill, poised and unshakable. It was time to further erase the lines between us. The game I had played so carefully would soon reveal itself, not in anger, but in the cold, calculated assertion of my rightful power. All would see how his arrogance crumbled like dry leaves, swept away by an unseen hand, leaving only the vestige of its former self behind. I was ready to step into the light, an architect of my own fate, reclaiming the space he had once denied me. In his downfall, I would not allow bitterness to taint my sweet victory. Instead, I would wear the new order like a crown forged from quiet triumph. The storm had arrived, and my patience was about to pay off. The weight of anticipation settled heavily upon me, a hush enveloping the bustling office as if time itself held its breath. I sat poised in front of my computer, fingers hovering just above the keyboard, savoring the moment before the final act of my quiet ascent. My former mentor flitted about the hallways, unaware, blissfully ignorant of the storm brewing within the confines of his accumulated hubris. His confidence had become his shroud, a dense mist obscuring reality. He laughed, paced with false bravado, unaware of the phantoms that gathered around him. I, the latent force, had become untraceable, hidden in plain sight, while I gathered each subtle tremor of discontent expressed in furtive glances and hushed conversations. They whispered of his mistakes, diminishing his once proud stature into mockery. The flickering fluorescent lights above danced in sync with the pounding rhythm of my heart. In this moment, I was not merely waiting. I was a marksman in the calm before the hunt, collecting breaths, appreciating that stillness has its own weaponry. Each colleague around me, engrossed in their fray, had keenly overlooked the intricate web of insight I had meticulously woven. I could almost hear the rustle of threads tightening, drawing taut as I prepared for the execution of my strategy. With a final inhale, I drew sharp focus onto the task in front of me. An email, the culmination of weeks of maneuvering and observation, lies ready to be dispatched like a sniper's bullet, swift and silent. Words chosen with surgical precision, each one holding the potential to shift the scales of power irrevocably. Every miscalculation he'd made became a weapon, the evidence of his carelessness laid bare, ready for the board's scrutiny. This was no mere correspondence. It was a lifeline to authority, a stepping stone to reclaiming the past he had so cruelly dismissed. As I pressed send, time suspended for an eternity, the digital echo reverberating in the void. There it was, my silent proclamation, a strike not of chaos but of calculated precision. The pieces clicked into place, nexus of fate aligning around him while he remained trapped in the confidence of his superiority. I leaned back in my chair, the world around me fading into mere noise, drowning in the thrum of impending change. He began to falter almost immediately. Each reaction became a step backward, each misguided decision magnified in the eyes of the executives now engaging with my insights. It was uncanny, the way his laughter faded, replaced by the disconcerting weight of scrutiny. For a moment, I indulged the thought of his expressions, confusion blossoming into panic, the labyrinth of walls he had built around himself closing in. And then, impossibly, came the moment of clarity when he would realize it was uncontested. He had overlooked me far too long, and now I stood ready, not as a rival in his eyes, but as the storm returning to reclaim the land he had stripped from me, piece by piece. No dramatic confrontations awaited us, only the cold silence of calculated precision, awaiting the execution of his own folly. Now I was ready to take my place where he had once denied me entry. The seat he mocked would soon become mine. I could feel it pulsate like a heartbeat, waiting, beckoning me forward into its promised warmth. I didn't seek vengeance in anger. I sought it in revelation. The restless comfort of knowing that power wasn't taken. It was earned, silently, steadily. In this moment, stillness reigned, teetering on the precipice of change. The curtain was drawn back, and the stage was set. I would embrace the repercussions, donned not in joy but in a solemn acknowledgement of the weight of authority. The farce was over. I had taken the reins of destiny, and now his downfall awaited in the quiet shadows of my contrived ascent. The office hummed with an anxious energy, a symphony of whispered conversations and clattering keyboards. I sat at my desk in the corner, blending into the backdrop of a corporate world that had become both my grave and my weapon. My fingers poised over the keyboard. The tension in my body was electric, every muscle taut with anticipation. It was time. In the distance I saw him, my former mentor, now a hollow version of the man who had once guided me, rolling through the halls with an overinflated ego, laughter echoing like a broken mask. He was blind to the storm building around him, oblivious to the rumblings of discontent that rippled through the organization. The pulse of the office shifted. Colleagues exchanged glances laced with tension, the whispers growing bolder with every passing moment. I could sense the ground shifting beneath him. That first strike, my strategy brief, had flown like an arrow aimed squarely at the heart of his hubris. It was a surgical incision, swift and hidden beneath layers of corporate jargon. I had spun the data points into a narrative he could never foresee, revealing every miscalculation he swept under the rug. As I hit send, the weight of retribution settled over me like a shroud. I had not merely struck back. I had orchestrated a resurrection of authority, redefined by silence rather than fury. Around me, the office carried on, blissfully unaware of the unfolding drama. My former mentor strolled through the corridors, laughter extravagantly masking the unraveling ropes that bound his position to the ground. His eyes held a flicker of unease, a shadow dancing behind the confidence he wore like armor. I couldn't decide what was more satisfying, the fact that it was unraveling, or that he had no idea it was me guiding the dagger toward his back. How ironic, I mused, as I observed his facade of control falter. It was chaos cloaked in the calm of indifference, applause drowned in whispers. I was his ghost, haunting the very shadow he had cast aside for arrogance. What was once a swift motion in his favor was now a well-coordinated fall into confusion, the peeling veneer of superiority exposed to the elements. Days melded into a tapestry of anticipation, but the reality was that silence served me well. I watched as he scrambled to recalibrate, bewildered by the reverberations of my quiet upheaval. Every defensive maneuver hastily concocted was met with my calculated response, the feedback loop pushing him deeper into the abyss of misunderstanding. I reveled in the observation, feeling more alive with each moment. I stood on the precipice, unyielding amidst the crumbling edifice he had constructed. The executives I had never engaged directly were now tangled in conversations about metrics and strategy that sung a tune familiar to me, one he had played with reckless abandon. He was entangled in the consequences of his own ambitions, and without noticing, he was losing grip on the ground he'd trod so skillfully. It was the day of the internal audit when the air shifted, thick with the anticipation of revelation. The feedback draped over him like a shroud, whispering truths that bore the weight of my quiet orchestration. As names crossed the report and the executive's brows furrowed with concern, I felt that ice-cold satisfaction wash over me. This was no confetti at the height of victory. It was the muted exhale of justice, the resonance of balance returning. His name appeared in bold, a mere footnote in the downfall of his carefully constructed empire. I didn't feel glee. I felt resolute, my heart steady as I witnessed the fallout. There was no need for outbursts or pointed fingers. The truth spoke for itself. The once dominant predator lay exposed, an open wound that revealed the ignorance he had nurtured in his own garden of vanity. As the shifts took place, I remained an echo, a ghost who had returned to reclaim what was rightfully mine while he flailed in the chaos. My silence echoed louder than any screams. It filled the void between his breaths, a reminder of the cost of underestimation. Once blindsided by dismissal, I was now cloaked in authority, anticipated yet elusive. With his influence unraveling like thread pulled from fabric, I allowed myself a moment to breathe it in. It was exquisite not in its celebration, but in the realization of my evolution. I had become what he never believed I would. He would watch as the seat he had once dismissed became mine, a quiet power reclaimed without the fury he might have expected. In the cold corridors of the office, I lingered as the shadows deepened around him. The moment danced on the threshold of revelation, his awakening just beyond the horizon, clouded by the dismissive arrogance that had once shielded him. I held my breath, patience unfurling like wings taking flight, ready to embrace the moment when the storm I'd summoned reached its crescendo. Finally, as the dust settled and the silhouette of his career faded into the background, the email, the mocking "move on," echoed in my mind. A taunt turned to truth. He had forced me to adapt, to grow in silence and determination. Victory may leave scars, but it also brings clarity. I felt a profound liberation from those chains of despair he once so casually forged. Tonight, alone in the stillness of the office, I reclaimed the narrative. There was no joy, no raucous fireworks, only the gentle echo of balance restored and an unwavering calm that poured over the cold roads I had walked alone. In this chiaroscuro of vengeance, I had not just moved on. I had become who I needed to be. The game had shifted, and the silence whispered of the power I now held. I walked through the office corridors, the air both familiar and foreign, each step resonating with a softness that belied the intensity of my journey. Around me, the rhythmic thrum of keyboards and the muted conversations of colleagues filled the space. Yet they seemed like echoes from a distant world, one I was finally ready to leave behind. In this moment, I felt the weight of clarity settle over me, as palpable and cold as the steel-finished desk that once housed my plans for revenge. With every passing glance, I sensed the evolving dynamics of the workplace, an unseen energy shifting tides and rearranging allegiances like pieces on a chessboard that I had silently orchestrated. My former mentor, once a towering figure I had looked up to, now felt like a shadow, what was left of a man desperately clinging to the remnants of authority he had unleashed upon himself. How easy it had been for him to dismiss my worth, to hide behind laughter and an air of superiority, oblivious to the storm he had sown. I had let those moments fester, allowing them to carve out the path to my own quiet ascension. If power was noise, I had learned to be a whisper. My transformation had begun not with a battle cry but through keen observation. Each learned silence a tool that had meticulously dismantled his arrogance. There were no fireworks in the wake of his downfall. Only the stillness of retribution served in muted tones, where even the smallest misstep became an avalanche, burying pride beneath unyielding scrutiny. I reached the hallway, a passage that had once seemed confining but now felt liberating. The polished floors reflected the muted glow of overhead lights, a corridor stretching towards a future finally within reach. No more ulterior motives disguised as mentorship. No more facades hiding the truth of betrayal. I was rebuilding not just a career, but reclaiming a fragment of myself lost in the embers of ambition and deceit. There he was, lingering in the distance, the very embodiment of the arrogance he had cultivated over the years, wearing it like a badge despite its fraying edges. Our eyes met briefly, a fleeting moment suspended in time. Recognition flickered between us, a silent exchange where I felt neither animosity nor vindication, only a profound sense of relief. I nodded. No words were necessary. It was not confrontation I sought, but closure, a quiet acknowledgement that we had both played our parts in this ruthless game of power. I had replaced him, not with a roar of victory, but with a solemn nod that echoed with finality. In that moment, I understood my true strength. I was unshakeable, no longer tethered to the chains of his arrogance, no longer the apprentice. I had become the master of my own fate. I turned away, my footsteps echoing slightly against the walls that had once enclosed me in doubt. Each stride carried with it the resonance of liberation, the bittersweet taste of reclamation swirling within, not as a celebratory high, but as a deeply felt peace. Stillness enveloped me. Clarity washed over the remnants of my path, while the chaos faded with each step. The door of the office loomed ahead, a barrier once perceived as an ending. But now it was merely a threshold towards new beginnings. I stepped through it, the air outside crisp and refreshingly empty. As I walked down the endless road ahead, I realized the journey had transformed me in ways I had never anticipated. He had said to move on, and I had. I had taken his job, yes, but more importantly, I had reclaimed the autonomy I had lost. There were no fireworks marking my victory, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing power had shifted, not with fanfare, but with surrendering to the reality of what lies ahead. And that was how one wins, in silence, in strength, in simple, deliberate closure beneath the vast sky stretching out before me, empty and inviting, just like my newly claimed path. A faint echo of relief reverberated in my chest, not for the scales I had tipped, but for the quiet victory of moving on. Because now, truly, I was beyond.